Now, the broadcaster Michael Buerk has said that obese people should be given the choice to indulge if they wish, and that if they are overweight, they are weak, not ill. Writing in the Radio Times, the BBC presenter said the obese will die a decade earlier than the rest of us. See it as a selfless sacrifice in the fight against demographic imbalance and climate change. Give them the facts to make informed decisions. By all means, nudge all you like, but in the end, leave the couch potatoes alone. They are weak, not ill. Well, joining me to discuss more from Walkerburn in Scotland is the author of Panic on a Plate and Science and Technology Director of the Academy of Ideas, Rob Lyons, and also from Central London, the Director of Obesity UK, Sarah LeBrocq. Sarah, to you first of all, what's your reaction to Michael Buerk's comments?
To be honest, I think they're pretty horrifying, but actually not kind of... Society thinks that people living with obesity are lazy and eat too much. And, so that's the kind of message that's out there. So, he's just reaffirming that, I guess, which is quite horrifying that the media are giving him the platform to do so. So that is quite upsetting because I'm a big believer, and the science actually supports this, that obesity is a disease. And it's about time that we recognise that.
Rob, what's your view? Is it a disease, or is Mr. Buerk right that people are large because they eat too much?
Well, I think it's not as simple as either of those things, really. I mean, I think Sarah's right to point out that these things aren't necessarily entirely within our control. I mean, there's a huge genetic component to obesity. Obesity clearly runs in families, we know that. And that in a society where we have, complete access to any food that we want, pretty much for most of us, then those genetic components really come to the fore. But I still think there is a personal choice element to it as well. And I think from that point of view, we should be free to make those choices about whether we want to eat foods that we enjoy, possibly to other people's idea of excess, or spend our time, going to the gym and eating salad in order to look slimmer. That should be our choice. I don't think it's the government's place to interfere with those choices by taxing one food or another.
Isn't that Michael Buerk's point, really, Sarah, that actually, but by treating it as a disease, we're saying you can be cured of it? And he is essentially saying, it seems to me, actually, there's nothing wrong with obesity. If you are happy overeating and you know that you are going to be large and you're content with that, you shouldn't be told by the state to stop doing it. You shouldn't be guilt-tripped into losing weight.
Well, no, because what he's saying is that somebody living with obesity has chosen to live that way. And I think that's the message that needs to change. Obesity is a very complex condition. And like Rob's just said, a lot of it is down to genetics. In fact, 70% of it is. So actually, if genetics are meaning that you've got a more predisposition to have obesity or not, then it's not a choice. So therefore, by saying that you can eat what you like, it's about understanding why people eat what they do. Because actually, if your body is craving or wanting a certain food group because of your genetics, then you can't change that to some extent. So I think what we need to understand is the true science behind obesity and the complexities of it. Because there are 100 different reasons why people live with obesity, and it's not just about the food that they eat. And that is what we focus on far too much in this society. We focus on eat less, move more. And that is not what is helpful for somebody living with obesity.
Rob, what do you think of the comments that Michael Buerk made about, that they are more likely to die early? It will relieve pressure on the NHS, and indeed that they are paying for their size through VAT and unhealthy foods anyway, so they're not really costing the economy a great deal.
Well, to the extent that obesity does lead to shorter lives, then it means that people receive less healthcare over their lifetime, they receive fewer pensions and so on and so forth. And I think that's really a response to this idea that promoted by, amongst other people, by the head of the NHS, that obesity could eventually bankrupt the NHS. And I think that that's completely wrong. When you look at total public spending per person, frankly, more of it goes to those people who live longer, who live the so-called healthier lifestyles, who don't smoke or drink to excess, and who are overweight on average. So that claim is completely wrong. And I think, therefore, it's false to use the idea that you're going to bankrupt the NHS to try and force people into eating the right foods or living the appropriate lifestyle, because the opposite is, if anything, true. That point is true. I think that I think it's much more important that we just let people make their choices for themselves. If you're happy being big and eating the foods that you want to eat, then you should be allowed to do that. If you're prepared to make the sacrifices, and for some people, resisting their genetics is a major sacrifice in order to stay slimmer than they would otherwise be, that should be their choice as well. It shouldn't be for the government to make those choices for us.
Sarah, what do you think of that? That people, some people could choose to be larger than they are, that those people should be allowed to make that choice?
Yeah, I do think, we live in a world where people should have free choice and people should have the choice to eat whatever they want. But I think what we need to understand is kind of the mechanisms behind why people might choose a certain food over another. And we also need to think about the obesogenic environment that we live in. So it's not just a case of, people just suddenly going, oh, I want to eat a burger, for instance. We live in a society where fast food is everywhere, where processed food is everywhere. And so there is some... I do think the government do need to take action to some extent in stepping in from that. But what I feel uncomfortable about is the fact that we're still talking about food. And obesity is not just about food. It's a lot more complicated than that. There are lots of genetics, biological, physiological, societal things involved. But yet all we're talking about in this interview is food. And I think that's where the narrative needs to change. It's not just about eating less.
I mean, the reason we are talking about food in relation to it is because that's precisely what Michael Buerk's comments were about, and that is why we are talking about it today. Rob, you were shaking your head as Sarah was talking, especially when she was talking about the government regulation of fast food.
Well, I think that this is the problem, is that because there is this assumption that because there is the availability of all these tasty foods, many of which I consume a lot of myself, that this kind of forces us into being obese in some way, and that therefore the government needs to regulate it. I think we can control. I believe in our ability to make our choices for ourselves and decide whether we want to forego that doner kebab or hamburger in exchange for being slimmer and the benefits or otherwise of being less obese. I mean, we can make those decisions ourselves. We don't need the government to intervene to make those choices for us. And I think that you can see throughout people's lives that they can suddenly make a decision, right, I'm going to be slim and lose huge amounts of weight. But it is a huge sacrifice. That is true.
Sarah, is that a fair point that if you are committed to losing weight, whether it be because of genetics or for any other reason, it shouldn't necessarily be up to the government to be responsible for that? It's up to you, it's up to your doctors, it's up to your lifestyle, it's up to whatever it is you choose to do, whatever medication you choose to take.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely not putting this on the government. I'm not blaming anyone, because I feel like, again, in the arena of obesity, we do blame people too much. We blame the individuals, we blame the government, we blame the food companies. It's not about blaming. It's just one of the small factors. You can't deny the fact that the obesogenic environment does play a part. That is detailed in the Foresight report from 2007. That's one of the factors. So no, I'm absolutely not saying that this is the government's fault and that the government need to do it. But I think people need to understand that the obesogenic environment does play a part in this, as does someone's psychological mindset, or as does their physical activity, or as does their genetics. They all play a part. And I think that's the message I'm just trying to get across, is the fact that it's not just about focusing on one of the factors. We need to look at them all as a whole to get a well-rounded picture of what living with obesity is like and how we can control things. Because actually 95% of people that lose weight will put it on over 5 years because of the science and because of the way that the body works. So we need to bear that in mind as well.
Sarah LeBrocq from Obesity UK, thank you very much for joining us, and also Rob Lyons from the Academy of Ideas. Thank you both.